Yeah, so this morning we're talking a little bit about this idea of turning points. And I was thinking in my life, like kind of significant turning points that I felt or experienced during different seasons of my life. And I remember back in Lake of the Ozarks, I had one. And it was when I used to live in Lake of the Ozarks back when I was a youth pastor several years ago, I think it was about 12 years ago. And I remember, it's kind of embarrassing, but it is what it is. I remember we lived in a townhome, and I remember I had to go up the stairs to get something and then come back down. And I remember when I went up the stairs, I remember being winded. And it was like this moment in my life where I was like, I am far too young to be winded when I walk upstairs. And like, it's that moment where it's like, okay, so am I just going to become comfortable with this? Or like, am I going to try to do something about the fact that I'm getting winded walking up the stairs? And so I had that moment where I was like, okay, I'm going to start doing cardio. And because I was like, I don't want to do, like, I don't want that to happen to me again. And so I remember about 12 years ago, I started running. I think I started running about a half mile a day. And it just became a part of my life because I reached this point where I was like, you know what, I don't know that I really want to be that guy anymore. And the text that we're looking at this morning is one where it's about a breaking point. Not really just one breaking point, but it's about two breaking points. And what we've been doing is we've been walking through the book of 1 Samuel, looking at the life of the different characters in 1 Samuel, and we've seen Saul and we've seen David. And what we see in our text this morning is we see two breaking points, one with Saul and one with David. And just to kind of catch you up on the story, just so that we're all tracking together, at this point in the text, so we're at 1 Samuel chapter 19. At this point in the text, David had defeated Goliath. And it was still recent history when this happened. And so people would have thought of David as the guy who defeated Goliath. That because David defeated Goliath, I mean, just imagine, like, this is a story that people who don't even know, like, who aren't even Christians are familiar with today. Just imagine what it would have been like when they lived it. Because it's such a good story, such a big story, people learned who David was. And as they learned who David was, he started to gain notoriety, gain popularity, and became really what I would say is a folk hero in the nation of Israel. And as he achieved this status, there was a king. There's a man named Saul. What we know about Saul is we know he was an evil king. He was kind of an egomaniac. He was like really the quintessential like worst boss of all time. And he saw David gaining in notoriety, becoming more and more famous. More people are falling in love with David. And Saul he couldn't deal with that. And so he started to hate David because people loved him. So last week we saw kind of this, moving to this breaking point that we're at, we saw Saul, he got so, like, he had such a deal with David that David would play the lyre for him in his house. And Saul was so tormented that he threw a spear at David 2 times while he was playing the lyre. David, being the kind of guy that he does, he decides to stay, which is crazy. And then Saul realizes that's not how he's going to kill David. And so what Saul did, and what we looked at last week, was how Saul tried to kill David by putting him in places militarily where David would be at an extreme disadvantage. And every single time he put David in one of those places, David was more victorious, he experienced more success, and people fell deeper in love with David, and he became even more of a hero. So Saul gets to this point in his life where here we are picking up in verse 19 where he is done subtly trying to kill David. Like, he's a mad king. And because he's a mad king, he views someone who loves him as a threat. And when you do that, the only thing you can do is kill him. And we see this start in chapter 19, verse 1. With all the subtlety gone, and you see Saul reach his breaking point with David, it says this. It says, and Saul spoke to Jonathan his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. What a sad thing. This is the guy who defeated Goliath. This is the guy who's going out and fighting for this king, giving him victory that the king is not doing himself, which is what he should be doing himself. And because Saul can't handle it, he thinks his only solution is to try to kill David. And this time, instead of subtly trying to do it in battle, he's like, no, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to talk about what we want to do. And what we want to do is we want to kill David. And if you notice, Jonathan's involved in this meeting. Now, Jonathan is Saul's son, and he's Saul's son, but he couldn't be more different than Saul. Where Saul sees David as a threat, Jonathan sees David as a friend. And so this is how Jonathan responds to the news. Keep going here. It says, but Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. As we've spent the last several months studying 1 Samuel, and one of the characters that I find just so incredibly underrated is Jonathan. You have this guy, and if you just think about Jonathan, there is not a person in this story who benefits more from David's death than Jonathan. What we know about Jonathan is we know that he's a military hero. Like, he has brought Israel salvation on numerous occasions, that he's defeated Philistines. Like, he's been a good dude. If David dies, then there's nothing that stands in the way of Jonathan getting to the throne. Surely Jonathan's somewhat aware of David's conversation with Samuel. Surely Jonathan's somewhat aware of the fact that people are talking about how David's going to replace Saul as king. That if Jonathan just keeps his mouth shut and lets his dad kill David, then David won't be king and Jonathan will likely be king. But what we see here in Jonathan is we see that Jonathan is far more concerned with God's kingdom advancing than he is concerned with what might personally benefit him. So he goes and he warns his friend. Not only does Jonathan warn his friend, but what we see is that he also corrects his dad. Look at this. Verse 4. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he's not sinned against you, because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand when he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against the innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. And Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. And then there was war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow so that they fled before him. So interesting. It's almost like Jonathan's like talking to his dad. He's like, dude, you like David. Like, you understand. Like, when Goliath came out, dude was the only guy that was willing to fight Goliath. Like, you weren't going to do that. Like, why would you want to kill the guy who's doing what you should be doing? And Saul's like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. But I think it's so interesting, though. Like, there's so many things about this that's so interesting. One of the things is also, like, it says that David was in Saul's presence as he was before. Just, like, think of the awkward tension that would be in the room as they're there together. Saul has told people, yeah, I want to kill that guy. And now they're like having meals together. I'm just saying, like, I've been in situations where people have said far worse, like not nearly as bad stuff about me, and I feel uncomfortable in the room. I can only imagine what David's thinking. Like, he's sitting there eating, like, so I wonder if there's poison. Like, I don't know, like, but they're there as it was before. And so as they're kind of back interacting like they were, a battle breaks out with the Philistines again. And who should go? Well, David should go. David goes, and he achieves another great victory at his hand. And what I find so interesting is like Israel experienced salvation one more time under David. And the reason why it happened, it wasn't just David's military strength. It also happened because Jonathan had a conversation with his dad. And I just think too, like sometimes we look at our contribution to the kingdom. And when I say the kingdom, I would just say our ability to help people know Jesus better. And sometimes what we do is we think about our contribution. We think of what we're doing. We just assume that it's not that significant. And I would ask you that when Jonathan stands before God someday, I mean, do you think that maybe there's a chance that he's going to get some credit for David getting this battle? Because if Jonathan doesn't talk to his dad, if Jonathan doesn't warn David, if these things don't happen, then the battle with the Philistines doesn't come either. But because Jonathan was willing to be a peacemaker, David is able to get one more victory. And I think for us, sometimes this is what we do. We think about our contribution to the kingdom. We think of what we're doing to help people know Jesus better. And I imagine a lot of us, when we think about what we're doing, we think something along the lines of, I just don't think that what I'm doing is that significant. I just don't think that what I'm doing is really making that much of a difference. I don't think that what I'm doing really matters that much. And to you, I would just point out Jonathan. And I would say that everything that you do for the kingdom matters. It could be something, because you just don't know like the trickle effect of your actions. Like you don't know how your kind deed is going to impact someone down the road. We don't know. I mean, even here at the church, that every single thing that goes into a weekend is part of a cog in a machine that's helping people know Jesus better. Every single thing matters. From us mowing the yard, to people greeting you as you walk in the door, to people helping you find a seat if you're late, to having cafe stuff stocked up with food, to have people watch your kids and invest in your youth, that every single thing that happens, it helps people know Jesus better. And if you're doing something, then you can be confident that God sees it. And not only does God see it, but he will eventually reward it. That with every life that's changed here, that you're someone who serves, if you're someone who's investing, if you're someone who's doing that, you're part of what God is doing here. It doesn't just work that way with serving, it also works that way with giving. That we are able to do the things that we are able to do because people are generous. That we function on generosity. And I've been in seasons here at the church where it was like, how do we make this 7 cents and a banana work? And then I've been in seasons where it's like, okay, man, God is really blessing us. What's the best way to steward what God has given us? And here's what I can tell you. God uses both. God absolutely uses and works in both, but it's a lot easier when you have options more than in a banana. Like we have stuff coming up that we're really excited about, believing that God's going to do. We have this Mother's Day stuff that's coming. We've got the Schools Out party, and then we've got this whole frontage thing that's going to happen hopefully this year. And so, looking at you, Dodd. But so like we're hoping we've got this stuff that's happening that we're able to do that because of your generosity. It gives us the ability to help people know Jesus better. And I think Jonathan's story shows us that. It shows us that if you're doing something, God sees it, and not only does God see it, but God can use it to bring about the advancement of his kingdom. So you have this situation. David's back in Saul's service. Things are back to normal. David goes out and gets a battle, wins a victory. But Saul is Saul. And he can only take so much of David's success. Look at this. It says, then the harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul. We've talked about this spirit a lot, but essentially the idea there is that Saul's opening himself up to to his inner demons, and he's not seeking God, asking him to help him. Then the harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul, and as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, as David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. And Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. I just find this so sad. That you have Saul, who is, really, he's the most powerful person in all of Israel. He's the king. And the king in the king's house just sits in his house with a spear in his hand because he's afraid. And you think, what is he afraid of? I would assume he's probably afraid of David. Which is crazy. Because not once has David ever attacked him. Not once has David ever said a bad word about him. Not once has David done anything to make him think that he should be afraid. But Saul thinks he has to hold the spear in his hand. And this shows us when we go down the path of wickedness, we start to view things as a threat that aren't. We start to think that everyone's out to get us when they're not. We start to only imagine the worst possible scenario that's going to happen every single time. And the problem with that, and what that reveals in us when we do that, is what it's showing about Saul. And it's that he didn't trust God. Because if you trust God, you put the spear down. And so you have this happening, and then you also have David reach his breaking point. So I remind you, last week, Saul threw 2 spears at him. Or last chapter, he threw 2 spears at him. David stayed. David stayed, and we celebrated the fact that David stayed. Now, this morning, as we look at chapter 19, 1 spear is thrown, and David's like, all right, I'm done. That's enough. And it just shows you the complicated nature of God's will. That sometimes it's God's will for you to stay, and sometimes it's God's will for you to go. And as you look at this text, as we see what comes next, we see that it is God's will, that God is with David as he escapes. And it starts with this woman who we met last week, a woman named Michal, his wife, who was meant to be a snare to David. And it's so interesting because the text we're going to read, she kind of is and she's kind of not. Look at this here. It says, Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. Now, I don't know why she's telling him that. David already knew that. He decided that he was going to leave. So Michal let David down through the window, and he went away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said he's sick. And then Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair at his head. And Saul said to Michal, this is the best you could do. Goat's hair, really, that's okay. Why have you deceived me thus and let my enemies go, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? So you've got this scene where you have this person who Saul put in David's life to be a snare to him. To kind of be his person on the inside that can help bring David down. And it's so interesting because she kind of tries to, but you could also argue that her cunning is why David was able to escape ultimately. If she doesn't let him down the window, he doesn't go. And the reason why I think it's not as simple as just she's on his side is that if you look at 2 things in the text, it doesn't seem like she's totally on his side. First, it says that there was an image. Now, that also can be translated idol. And more likely, it's an idol. So in David's room, Michal has an idol set up. Saul put Michal in David's life to try to be a snare to David. The idea there is that his thought was, okay, maybe if I can put Michal with David, she can cause David to worship an idol and turn away from the Lord. Well, you can see that she's clearly trying because there's an idol in their home. But what's so interesting is that this thing that was meant to be a snare to David is part of what God uses to allow David to escape. And so you have that happening, but then you also have her story that she tells her dad. And on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, what else is she going to say? Is she going to say, I loved him and I let him escape? Which is fair. But does she have to go that far? I mean, she says to her dad, David said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? And so you definitely get this picture that maybe she's like kind of playing her dad, trying to make her dad mad at David, trying to stay on her dad's side. And so all of this is happening. David is now, he's on the run. And David spends the rest of 1 Samuel on the run as a fugitive. But what we see here, which is so interesting about David, and it reveals his character and his heart, is where is the first place that he runs when he realizes he has nowhere to go? He runs to the prophet Samuel. Look at this. It says, David fled and escaped. And he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. That you can tell a lot about a person by the first place they go when trouble comes. He runs to God. And Samuel's not the only place he can go. Like, David's a military leader. He could have ran to his troops and been like, hey, let's do this. He could have ran to another nation and been like, hey, will you give me refuge? I'll fight for you. Like, there's a lot of options that he has. But he runs to the prophet because he knows that that's where you should turn if you want to be God's king. And then Samuel protects him. And he protects him in, to be honest with you, the strangest way I've ever seen someone protected. Look at this. So Saul gets word that David's with Samuel. And then this is what happens. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of prophets prophesying, and Samuel was standing his head over them, the Spirit of God came on the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. And when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also prophesied. This is not what I think of when I think of biblical prophecy. Like Saul is saying, oh, let's kill him. I'll send my men. Go kill David. And they get to David, and they just start prophesying. It's so weird. And then he's like, put yourself in Saul's shoes, okay? Like, I sent the guys to kill David. They just started prophesying? Okay, I guess send these guys. I mean, just imagine, like, you send someone to the store to get butter. And their story is, every time I get to the eggs, I just start prophesying. Like, eventually, like what is going on? And I would just imagine, like, these are people who, like, these are warriors who are being sent to David. Like, these aren't guys that go to prophecy camps on the weekend. Like, these are warriors. And to be honest, if you judge the spiritual state of Israel right now, chances are they're not even religious spiritual folk. They haven't, and you can assume that because they're trying to capture the Lord's anointed so that he can die. And every time they go, they are overcome by the presence of God in such a way that they literally can't move or they lose control. And then there's like questions that I have. Okay, so one is like, what were they saying? Because they're prophesying is what they're doing. And so now this is like Ryan Goeden biblical fan fiction, so I don't know if it's like true, but if it's prophecy, like they're probably speaking of the goodness of God, and they're probably also speaking of his salvation. Generally, that's what prophets say. And if they're speaking of his salvation, well, the means by which God was going to save his people Israel during this time was David. So they're going to kill him, and it's likely that they're now talking about him being their salvation. And then you got to put yourself in these guys' shoes. Like, what would you think about God if that was you. And it's in my opinion, it's very gracious of God. He has the ability to send fire down from heaven. He has the ability to swallow them up in the earth. There's a lot of options of what he could do, but here he just overcomes them with the spirit of prophecy. And they realize that he is far more powerful than they ever would have realized before. So Saul sees this happening, and he's like, I think he does what any of us would have done after you get that story 3 times. You'd be like, well, I guess I'll go. And when he goes, he realizes that it wasn't a story, but it's actually what happened. Look, then Saul went to Ramah, and he asked, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they are at Naioth and Ramah. And he went there, and the Spirit of God came upon him also, and as he went, he prophesied. And he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. And thus it is said, is Saul also among the prophets? Like, what an image, right? I like the way that one commentator put it, that it shows how God can be gently invincible. That there's nothing that you can do to stop him or his purposes. Inevitably, they will all be done. And what I find so interesting is you have this Saul character, and it says Samuel stood over him. Like, this is a guy that Saul has banished essentially from his presence because he's tired of Samuel telling him things he doesn't want to hear. And so he doesn't seek Samuel. This is like the first time Samuel comes back in several chapters, and here he is standing over him, prophesying. And then, so you have what we're seeing here in the text is you see that God is protecting David. That he's going to great lengths to protect David. But you also see that God is showing us that Saul will not be king forever. And there's some words I just don't like to bold on the screen, and one of them is naked. But I would just draw your attention that it says that he lay naked. And the picture there, the image there, is that when you were king, you wore clothes that made you look like a king. You could just tell by the way that someone dressed that they were king. And here you have Saul, when he's overcome by the presence of God, he no longer looks like a king. That God has taken his kingly clothes off, in essence, to say to us, in my presence, no one is king but me alone. And not only is he taking the clothes off, but he's also saying, but someday they will be on this David guy. And so as we look at this text, I find it incredibly interesting, but it's the part that I couldn't shake as I was just looking and thinking about it this week is the part where like the sermon last week, okay? It was 1 Samuel 18. David got 2 spears thrown at him, and we said, man, isn't it good that David stayed? You remain faithful where you are. Like, this is way to go, David, because he knew that this is what he needed to do to get where God had him to go. Okay, now here we are 1 week later, 1 chapter later, 1 spear is thrown. And now we look at the text and we're like, man, it's a good thing David left. And we know that it was a good thing David left. And we know that God wanted David to leave because he protected him with these prophets. And so it brings us to this place where when we think about God's will for our lives, okay, we see that God's will for us is very complicated and it's not a formula. And for me, that like, the answer isn't, okay, well, when someone throws a spear at you 3 times, that's when you got to go. Or when 3 things happen, that's when you know, because that's not how it works. But there's this incredible, like, tension that comes when we're trying to figure out what God wants us to do. And for me, as I look at this text, the part for me that, like, honestly just resonated with me was I read the text and I was like, man, I just hope that I can be like David and get it right when I need to get it right. And everyone in this room is either in the middle of a situation where you're trying to figure something out, or eventually you're going to be in a situation where you're trying to figure something out. Sometimes it's something toxic like what David's in. Maybe it's a toxic relationship and you're trying to figure out, what do I do here? Maybe it's a toxic work environment and you're like, man, but do I ride this out or do I? It's difficult. And I don't know that it's always as easy as, well, you stay. I mean, it's not always as easy as, do you go? Sometimes it's things that aren't toxic, but we want to get God's will right. There's some college kids in here, and I think that one of the questions you got to figure out, okay, so what do I do after I graduate? Like, that's a question that's tough that you got to try to figure out. Even like right now for all of us, like, I'm assuming that if you're a homeowner, or like, you're probably forced, like, you've been faced by this question, like, man, the market is up right now. Maybe this is a good time to sell my house. Like, that's not like a life or death situation. That's not whatever. All the realtors are like, amen, sell your house. But everyone else is like, what do you do? Like, it's not an easy circuit, but you go like, man, what do I don't know. Sometimes it's like, okay, is this career, is this what I want to do for the next however long I'm going to be working? And all of those are things that we'll face throughout our life. All of those are questions that we have to ask from time to time. And what this text makes me want to do, I just want to be like David in this circumstance, and I want to know that I get it right. And I think the question is, how did David get it right? And the reason David got it right is because David, he was able to understand God's will because he continued to cultivate a relationship with God. That this wasn't the first time that he sought him. This wasn't the last time that he sought him. This wasn't the first time that he looked to God for help. But this was really a pattern and part of his life. And one of the ways that we see this come out is that David actually wrote a psalm while he was experiencing the story that we just read. And this psalm gives us insight into David's psyche and into his heart. And I think it helps us as we talk about understanding God's will. Let me read it to you here. Psalm 59, verse 14. It says this. It says, each evening they come back howling like a dog and prowling about the city. They wander about for food and growl if they do not get their fill. But I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love in the morning. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in my day of distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to you, for you, O God, are my fortress, the God who shows me steadfast love. He knew him. And if we want to be able to decipher the things that God wants us to do, we have to cultivate a relationship with him so that we know that we really know him. In Romans chapter 12, it says that you offer your body as a living sacrifice. And if you do this, you're able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. That when you give yourself wholly to him, you know more about him and you know more about what he wants. And here we have David. And he says to God, he is my refuge and my fortress. What an incredible picture considering what he just experienced. Yeah, God was a fortress. He was absolutely a fortress because every time someone tried to attack, they were overcome by a spirit of prophecy. He knew this about God before the problem ever came. And my fear for us is that sometimes we wait till it's too late before we start cultivating that. Or we just think that because we're experiencing difficult circumstances, that must mean that God doesn't care. And I would just say to that, man, God loved David. And he let him go through everything that happened in chapter 19. And it wasn't because he didn't love him. And we know that that's not true because God let Jesus endure the cross. And there isn't a person who's lived who God loves more than Jesus. Your circumstances don't determine how God feels about you. But the beauty of a relationship with God is that when the circumstances aren't what you want, in him you can find resources to get through the circumstances that we wouldn't sign up for on our own. Would you pray with me this morning? Heavenly Father, we love you. And God, we're thankful that we can look to you. God, that we can find you and know you and experience your grace and your goodness. And God, I come to you this morning and I pray that your presence would rest on our hearts. God, I pray that you would give us hope in you and that we would find you. God, that you would help us in our seeking to know who you are. That you would help us not to wait until it's too late before we start trying to develop that relationship with you. And I pray, God, if there are people in this room who are hurting, who are struggling, there are people who are listening online who are hurting and who are struggling, I pray that, God, in Christ, they would find the resources to carry them through what they go through. And Jesus, my prayer is that if there's anyone here, anyone who's hearing, who doesn't have a relationship with you, God, that by the power of your presence and by the power of your Spirit, you would draw them to you. That you'd make them aware of their need for salvation, and they would put their trust in what you did for them on the cross. Jesus, we love you and we thank you. It's in your name.
Thank you for watching us on YouTube today. We hope that the content that you heard helped you know Jesus better.
Also, don't forget to click subscribe and to click the bell icon so that you'll get notified every time our channel drops a new video.
If you would like to partner with us in what God is doing here at New Life, there are 3 ways that you can give.
You can give by mailing a check to the church, you can give by going to giving.nlspringfield.com, or you can text 84321 with the amount that you'd like to give.
And if you would like to connect with us in any other way, you can visit us at nlspringfield.com, click on the Connect tab, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
See you next week.